For two brothers, an unexpected discovery amongst the personal possessions of their late grandfather is the beginning of an extraordinary journey.
Grandad died in 1983. My dad and I went across to clear out bits and pieces. In among it, we found three parts that clearly were something to do with an aeroplane. There was a joystick, the rudder bar that you control with your feet, and the magneto that provides the spark for the engine.
Research reveals they belong to a Bristol Scout, one of the first single-seat fighters of World War I. The very aircraft flown by their grandfather over 100 years ago.
They were enormously well loved by the pilots. They were fought over. People really wanted to have them.
And I think the idea came, well, we got these bits, why not build the aircraft around it?
I was generally interested in flying, I think.
To guide and inspire, they have the actual voice of their late grandfather, his words preserved in the sound archive of Britain's Imperial War Museum.
I was always interested in aeroplanes. As a boy, I used to cut out all the pictures and illustrated papers, and I used to take flight.
Although they have built single-seater aircraft as a hobby, building a replica of a 100-year-old machine means the team have to master outdated skills to achieve the authenticity they are keen to accomplish.
We had set ourselves the target of building an aircraft that was as accurate as we could possibly make it.
Originally, it was we just wanted to build the aircraft and fly it for ourselves. But David took it further, that he wanted to recreate history.
If building a World War I aircraft wasn't ambitious enough, their objective is to travel with the completed aircraft some 2,000 miles across Europe to the Greek island of Thassos.
The focal point of the whole exercise is to fly it over the Greek islands where my granddad was flying and fly from the same airfields that he flew from.
They then plan to fly the Scout over the Somme, paying tribute to another ancestor killed during one of the bloodiest days in the history of British warfare, and to commemorate all those who fought and lost their lives on that terrible day.
So we took a deep breath at that point and said, yes, let's go for it.
This is their story, a 15-year-long journey, rebuilding history. David Bremner and his brother Rick have been keen aviators from an early age. Like all boys at the time, model planes were the attraction, and together they developed a passion for flying.
Passion definitely developed together. We've always fueled each other's passions, whether it be music or flying or anything like that. But he's always been the leader. He's always been the organizer. And I've always sort of respected that, and we know each other's place. We know how to get on with each other. At times, I will tell him where he's doing it wrong, and he will listen. But on the whole, he tends to be the leader.
We lived only about 10 miles away from my grandparents, and we used to go across typically once a month for Sunday lunch. Often on those occasions, Grandad talked about his flying experiences during the First World War. When he did talk about himself, he referred to his favorite aircraft as the Bristol Bullet. You looked in recognition books and whatever, and there was no Bristol Bullet. And I must admit, I wondered whether he was telling us porkies.
Before the war, I was out in France when Pegu, who looped the loop, that was the first man who'd ever done that.
Grandad died in 1983, and my dad and I went across to clear out bits and pieces. He had a workshop. He'd always enjoyed mechanical things, and he had a whole lot of hand tools and this sort of thing, and that was the sort of stuff that we were looking for. But in among it, we found three parts that clearly were something to do with an aeroplane. There was the stick, the joystick, the rudder bar that you controlled with your feet, and the magneto that provides the spark for the engine.
Research reveals the parts belong to a Bristol Scout, one of the first single-seat fighters used in the early stages of World War I.
But, of course, the Bristol Bullet was the nickname for the Bristol Scout.
I was generally interested.
The Imperial War Museum in London houses a remarkable audio archive. The voices of World War I veterans, including David's grandfather, Francis Donald Bremner, Bunny Bremner, as he became known.
I was going to be drafted to fly the Bristol Scout, and I went with the CO to see one and found I couldn't get in. My knees wouldn't get under the crossbar. And I found that by taking the cushion out of the seat, that dropped my bottom sufficiently far to enable my thighs to be at such an angle that my knees would just clear the bump.
In 2002, David and his brother Rick approached their friend Theo Wilford, another keen aviator.
David showed me these bits, and I think the idea came that, well, we got these bits, why not build the aircraft round it?
It became clear we got a good team with Theo, with his experience in building aircraft, and David and I had already built one aircraft. Theo and he had built another one, and Theo had built one or two others on his own before that.
But of course we had to find drawings by the designer, Frank Barnwell. I found out that they were kept at the Royal Aeronautical Society archive.
So they're all in there, right? So one of a number of boxes.
And they were fantastic, opening up a notebook from 1913, 1914, and just smelling the paper and his beautiful, beautiful draftsmanship was a huge, huge pleasure.
The Bremners are becoming involved in the practical development of early aviation, just as others had over 100 years before. At the beginning of the 20th century, Bunny Bremner, like much of the world, is captivated by aviation as the Wright brothers take to the skies for the first powered controlled flight, the world's first aeroplane. It is a time for pioneers. A handful of aviation companies have sprung up during these early years. One is the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company, established by successful entrepreneur Sir George White.
He seemed to have an extraordinary ability to judge what was going to be the next really successful development in transport. And so he was the first to introduce the conventional overhead trolley electric tramway system to Great Britain, opening the first lines in Bristol and then doing it again in London. He built a huge empire into which he began to introduce the latest in technology. During the years before he opened the company, 1998, 99 in particular, the shadow of war was beginning to fall across this country. And anybody with any brains could see that things were going seriously wrong. The government, however, went into meltdown. They really didn't know what to do about it. He got involved in aviation in a curious way, I think. The story must have begun in 1904. I can't believe he didn't read the article about him. Two young men from Dayton, Ohio, named Wright, had claimed that they'd not only taken a heavier-than-air machine into the sky, but they'd also steered it in flight. And I just can't believe that a man who was so involved in modern technology and what was going to happen next in transport wouldn't have stopped and looked at it and taken an interest in it. I think it must have caught his imagination.
At the outbreak of war, Bunny Bremner enlists immediately in the Royal Navy. But his fascination with aviation remains. After a year at sea, he is given an unexpected opportunity of transferring to the Royal Naval Air Service. Starting his flying training, Bunny Bremner encounters an earlier machine produced by the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company.
Well, we had the very queer old machines, box kites with a 50-horse gnome engine, practically no instruments in it. You're just a rev counter, a petrol tap, a switch, and then your joystick and your rudder bar.
Just amazing. The thing is just so enormous.
One had to take a machine up and fly figure of eights in the air for a bit. And then land. Somebody was sent out into the middle of the aerodrome waving a white handkerchief, and you had to land within so many yards of him.
The box kite was one of the most successful aircraft of its time, but it soon fell behind as a result of its bulky and clumsy structure. But it isn't too long before the next generation of faster, more agile planes are being produced. In early 1914, Sir George White introduces the Bristol Scout.
They were enormously well loved by the pilots. They were fought over. People really wanted to have them.
What the team are lacking is an itemised factory listing of all the parts which the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company used in the manufacture of the Bristol Scout. Without it, their dream will have to be abandoned.
Extraordinarily, and was looking for something completely different in my great-grandfather's desk when I discovered that I had a brand new copy of the Bristol Scout parts list. And so every individual part is measured and described and photographed in this parts list.
It's just an astonishing document. It's not a factory document. It's not shop-soiled and dog-eared at the corner and so on. This is a coffee table book. So it's the full listing for the aircraft, every last little bit, every washer, every split pin, every little bit of leather, everything that you need to make a Bristol Scout. So we took a deep breath at that point and said, yes, let's go for it.
With a full set of plans and a detailed listing of necessary components, construction of the Bristol Scout begins. The team are in agreement. Their machine will be as exact and as accurate to the original as possible.
Once we'd got all the drawings gathered up, it seemed the most sensible thing to do was to build the wings first, because they're nearly all woodwork. Even a 100-year-old airplane, the drawings and plans are pretty detailed. And we knew it was only really advanced woodwork, advanced modelling and metalworking.
Early aircraft needed strong and lightweight wood, flawless in every respect. So the team must purchase wood that is perfect in every detail, and that comes at a cost.
If you have a knot or a resin pocket, it's a weakness. So you're looking for these bits of wood that are absolutely straight-grained, no knots, no resin pockets or anything.
Theo, very much the woodworker, because he's got a workshop with space to be able to spread out wings and fuselages and things like that. So he knows how to set up a jig to make ribs. David and I started doing the metal work, where the wood is joined, so you'd have a metal fitting, basically to hold the wooden spars together.
70, 80, 90. Long way to go. Oh.
And there were 350, 400 of these parts to make. And all being pretty much Victorian in era, beautifully designed with lovely curves and lovely to look at, but an absolute pig to make.
You can buy a metal sheet, take a hacksaw and a file, and cut each one individually. And we would probably today, 14 years on, still be cutting bits of metal if that's what we had chosen to do. But thankfully, these days, there are automated processes for cutting out the metal.
That's it. Wait. Yeah, good.
But in order to be faithfully accurate to the engineering of 100 years ago, they will have to learn some old techniques.
The splicing of the bracing cables, we all had to go at it. And in the beauty competition, Theo came out best, so he was voted as splicer-in-chief. There were about 200 to do in all.
The fuel tank is an awkward shape. Nothing is circular, nothing is a nice symmetrical shape that you can draw on a piece of paper.
I'll only drill lightly into your fingers because I've got this damper on it. The high-tech bit's all very good, but you can't do it in the backyard. And this, luckily, we can. And it's not only the aesthetics of the tank that matter, it's the fact that it needs to hold fuel, and anything goes wrong at, 500 feet, you're probably not going to survive it.
On the Western Front, millions of troops are dug into trenches that stretch from the North Sea to Switzerland. They have reached a bloody stalemate. Now the war is about to spread to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the shores of the Ottoman Empire.
The Gallipoli campaign starts because, in the view of certain people, there was no hope of success on the Western Front. And Winston Churchill comes up with the idea that we can knock Turkey out of the war.
Over 400,000 Allied troops will be drawn into the Gallipoli campaign. Among them is David's grandfather, Sub-Lieutenant Bunny Bremner. Airfields are created on the Greek islands of Imbros and Thassos, where the squadrons are then based.
We were sent to Imbros, which was the operational aerodrome, between Leaky Bay, which was the harbour. Most around us were sand dunes and hills on one side, down which the wind used to come, making landing rather difficult.
The Royal Navy Air Service's primary task is reconnaissance and spotting, warning of enemy movements and directing the heavy guns of the Royal Navy onto their targets.
Spotting you had to do in a two-seater. You had to have an observer. We had a wireless transmitter which he could transmit a code. You had to keep coming back towards the ship. Once I could see the top of the gun barrel, I knew I was under the trajectory. But on one occasion, she fired just as I was crossing. A 15-inch shell passing underneath me created such a disturbance that my own machine went down just like a stone. I think I dropped about 500 feet.
What was supposed to be a simple fight has turned into a nightmare. After months of relentless fighting and with many thousands killed and wounded, the Allies have lost the Gallipoli campaign. But to limit further casualties, a plan is devised to evacuate the battleground to withdraw without the Turks knowing.
You've got to realise what a tight situation this is. Anzac and Suvla had already been evacuated on the 19th of December. The Turks know we're going to go, but they don't know when.
One occasion I'd been spotting, and suddenly I found a Fokker behind me. And there was I only had a Lewis gun, which my observer could fire forwards and downwards. He had several bursts at me from behind and then made off. I tried to see where he was going, but found my engine revs were dropping, and he'd put bullet holes through most of the cylinders.
He manages to land on the airfield. When I say airfield, it's a field. He wants to set fire to his aeroplane, but they won't let him, because they're just evacuating the peninsula that very night.
The sight of a burning aircraft would have been just enough to warn the Turks the evacuation was taking place.
The evacuation proceeded completely uninterfered with. There is no Turkish awareness of what's going on, which would have been a disaster if they'd found out.
The troops evacuate the peninsula, ending the futile campaign. But Bunny Bremner and his fellow airmen remain. They transfer to the island of Thassos to maintain some sort of aerial presence in the region.
The focal point of the whole exercise is to fly it over the Greek islands where my granddad was flying. We understand that the airfields that he operated from are still in existence and more or less just need mowing to be usable.
Unfortunately, the team have reached their own standoff. Despite all their hard work, they are still missing an essential, all-important element.
The biggest problem is getting hold of the engine, and that's the key to it.
You can't go on eBay and buy an 80 horsepower Lorraine rotary. So when we set off on the whole build project, there was this big hole at the front of the aeroplane, and we had no idea how we were going to fill it. I had contacted the Shuttleworth Collection. Their chief engineer suggested that I contact the Vintage Aviator Limited in New Zealand.
The Vintage Aviator is a company that's dedicated to building and restoring flying machines from the 1914-18 era. It's the only group in the world that does this.
Theo and myself and my wife Sue went to New Zealand to see the Vintage Aviator Limited, to meet Jean and to watch our engine being run.
That's great.
It was the most fantastic, wonderful experience. It still chokes me up to think of it. Yeah, no, it was a very, very emotional moment.
Several months later, the engine, having travelled halfway around the world, arrives in the UK.
Wow, and somewhere in there, there's an engine, a couple of spare wheels here. And oil consumption, nearly 5 litres an hour.
Yeah, you better stock up on some castor oil.
Yeah, I better had a word with John.
As if their day couldn't get any better, they stumble upon something very useful.
What we discovered today, just as we walked past, is this propeller here. It doesn't look too much, it's not got a label on it or anything like that, but actually, if you look carefully, it's got up here the Bristol logo, which indicates that it was made by the Bristol Aeroplane Company. So what that means is that we're now able to get an exact copy of that propeller cut for use on our aircraft. And I know it sounds a bit nerdy, but it is very exciting for somebody like me to get something that's as original as that.
You know that saying, measure twice, cut once? I've got my own version. Measure 20 times, cut once. This is the first ever, probably the first ever, electronic CAD model of a 1917 Bristol Scout propeller. And using this CAD model, we feed it into the CNC machine and it will make us one. If you're sanding and you might go too far, you can stop. Whereas when the CNC machine's running, once the program's written, you press play and it's off cutting it. If it makes a mistake, it's too late. It's happened.
We were contacted by a member of the Light Aircraft Association, and they wanted us to be at their big annual rally. So we set off on a couple of trailers. 10 minutes down the road, I looked out at the back and I could see the fuselage rocking, but the trailer wasn't. We discovered that the problem was the wheel had broken, the metal had broken away, so the spokes were coming loose from the hub on one side of that wheel. We had tools in the back of the van, and we made a temporary jig to hold the axle in place to support the aircraft on the trailer on the way there. When we got to the rally, we had to work out how to get it off the trailer without turning the wheel. And it involved levers and about half a dozen people doing this very, very, very carefully. Okay.
Upon arriving and setting up, the team are met by a welcome sight.
Now, David, here is your propeller.
Wow.
Finished. Wrap it.
The propeller we received today, I mean, that is phenomenal. It really makes the aircraft come to life. Once you see the propeller on it, you sort of think, yeah, this airplane will fly. And it's a work of art in itself.
It's 2.5 meters long. It's made from American black walnut, and everybody who sees the aircraft has to go and stroke the propeller.
The next, from our point of view, really is going to be putting the fabric covering onto the fuselage and basically go around filling in all the details. To try and keep authenticity on this, we decided that we would stamp all the parts with the original number. This was the factory's number, which is what the factory did with each airframe they made. It was given the unique number for all the parts. In modern aircraft, you would glue the fabric to the structure using modern glues. They didn't do that. They'd sew the fabric for the wing, should we say, like an enormous pillowcase or a duvet cover. To tighten everything up and get it looking nice, you shrink the fabric using distilled water. You just spray it on. You then apply the dope, which is syrup, is probably the nearest description. So you paint it on. It gradually, over a period of time, tightened itself up. And now, if you see it, it is absolutely drum tight and looks beautiful. I painted the Union Jack onto the side of the fuselage and then painted the roundel on top. And we did this again because we believe this is how the plane was operational at that time. It probably would seem silly for us to bother to go to doing all this detail, but if you're going to do something and you're going to do it properly and authentically, then you do these sort of things.
And for complete authenticity, the team invite the great-grandson, Sir George White, to sign the propeller just like his great-grandfather did 100 years earlier. One final crucial hurdle remains before the Scout can fly. After years of research and construction, the aircraft will be officially inspected in order to obtain authorization to fly. It is an anxious time.
The certification for the aircraft in order to get the piece of paper to allow us to go and fly it it's always a little bit of a worry.
Because it's such an unusual aircraft and nobody's ever done a final inspection on a Bristol Scout before, Francis Donaldson was a little bit worried about it, so he thought, I'll wheel in some of the big guns. So he brought in the inspector, Mike Smart, who had been doing all the regular checks throughout the building process, and John Munn from the Shuttleworth collection with his huge knowledge of World War I aircraft. And all three of them had a go over it.
Before it can be deemed fit to test fly, they need to run the engine.
It's not pristine, and that's exactly how it should be. It was built for a wartime, and built in a time when, we weren't really concerned about the aesthetics. It was a purposeful machine, and that's what it is. So, yeah, I like that.
With papers signed and Scout 1264 given the thumbs up, the team can now focus on the first test flight.
When we had done the deal for the engine, Gene DeMarco had asked that he be allowed to carry out the first flight.
There is no other person in the world with more hours on World War I aircraft than Gene DeMarco ever in history, because he's been doing it all his life.
The engine started, it's warmed up, and Gene opens the taps, and off it goes.
This thing leapt off the ground within about 30 yards. It was unbelievable, and we couldn't believe it. And then he came in and did a 50-foot flyby, and we thought, wow, he's only flown it for 10 minutes. It's never flown before, and he's happy enough to fly it 50 foot off the ground just to show off to us.
It was as if he'd been flying it all his life.
And then he brought it down and did an absolutely perfect three-point landing. He made it look terribly easy. And his description afterwards, it flies nicely. For a World War I aircraft, it flies nicely.
Every time you see something you built take to the air for the first time, you realise it was all worth it. You've achieved what you set out to achieve.
Bristol Scout 1264 is certified and flight tested. After 14 years of worry, hard work, anxiety and devotion, David, Rick and Theo are ready to embrace the wartime experiences of Bunny Bremner. It's been 14 years since the old aircraft parts were found in Bunny Bremner's garage. Today, his grandchildren take their first flight in his beloved Bristol Scout.
Clearly, the first flight was a very nerve-wracking moment, and there was an element of worry. But for me, there was a distinct feeling of regret that we had completed the building process. For all those 14 years, we had been working up towards this moment. It's a door that you step through and you can never go back again.
Contact! Contact!
This is a single-seat aircraft, so your first flight in it is your first solo. So the worry is not that you will hurt yourself, but that you will damage the airplane.
There is just so much riding on this project. What I'm planning to do is a very simple flight to make sure that I land the aircraft safely at the end of the first go.
Having found I could fly the Bristol Scout, to practice on it. There was no instruction that I can remember of any sort. Just went up whenever I could.
It was very emotional. There was quite a lot actually to think about. It's not a very straightforward aircraft to fly.
Oh, it was a wonderful machine. You could do anything in it. And it was the best machine I ever flew. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Good grief. My granddad flew this when he'd only got 30 hours flying in.
Brilliant.
You just have to say,
Fantastic.
he must have been.
How was it? It was an amazing feeling that you were holding on to history, that you'd got a 100-year-old joystick in your hand and your feet were on a pair of 100-year-old rudder bars, the exact ones that your grandfather had held 100 years earlier.
With the Bristol Scout completed, certified and fully tested for airworthiness, the team begin a remarkable journey as they embrace the wartime flying career of Bunny Bremner. It's an exhausting 2,000-mile journey across Europe to reach the island of Thasos, where David and Rick's grandfather flew the Scout in 1916.
Well, it was a very much more isolated place. It was a very difficult aerodrome to approach because it was on a piece of land which rather jutted out into the sea. And on at least two sides of it were high hills.
100 years later, the same area that the airmen flew from is being cleared by the people of Thasos for the anniversary flight.
I suspect that the microclimate is going to be fairly interesting, and I think it will limit us to flying it probably only in the early morning and late on in the evening once the weather has basically calmed down.
I guess the main concerns really are the temperature. It's going to be very warm in the middle of the day, and the wind direction and strength.
Having travelled over 2,000 miles across Europe unscathed, at the final part of the journey, the group encounter their first mishap. David is told to move forward to start leaving the ferry, but is unaware of how close the trailer is to the car next to him. This produced a heated argument, as if it wasn't hot enough already on the island. In his pursuit to understand the historical impact war made on the area, Paskalis Palavousis, a local historian, has set about researching the locations of German bases on the mainland.
This building was a famous Ottoman tobacco company. The Germans had set up an aerodrome just here, by the warehouses. They were using the warehouse as their headquarters. To counteract this threat, the British and the French had to establish an aerodrome close, and the closest, most safe place was on Thasos Island.
We lived in tents, in a tented mess. And I think the worst disadvantage we had to put up with were the flies. And if you were eating a tea, if you were eating jam, you had to wave your hand over the jam all the way from the plate to your mouth until you're eating flies.
This is where the German seaplane base was, Seaflug Station Xanthi. They used to have 4 or 5 seaplanes operating from here, and they were flying against Thassos. They were bombing Thassos, and Thassos was bombing here.
I fitted a bomb rack just behind the engine, under the fuselage, just behind the engine. No bomb sights or anything like that. There was a hole in the floor of the fuselage. And I used to squint down through that, and I could see a target let the bombs go. And sometimes I'd pull the machine up too much, and the bombs bounced off my axle.
They did cause a great deal of damage during August 1917 on Thassos. They managed to blow up the bomb dump and petrol store. They chose this spot because the water here was more calm, although it's windy today. It was more calm because it's a lake. They were more protected here. And stationary water in between the fields, so there were many mosquitoes. They were suffering from malaria as much as the people on Thassos.
Having overcome the problems of their 21st century undertaking, the team unload and assemble their historic machine.
Yeah. Welcome home, 1264.
Well,
half of 1264.
The Bristol Scout has returned to its wartime home.
so how many turns are you putting in?
David is desperate to fly it over the island, following in the path of his grandfather.
I haven't stopped to think about it because we've been working hard, but to be able to fly from exactly the same spot that my granddad flew from exactly 100 years is just, it sends shivers down your spine. Today are primarily because the aircraft's been dismantled, and we need to make sure that when we put it back together again, we haven't forgotten anything.
Yeah.
The plan now is to start the engine, see if it runs okay, and the wind continues to drop off, we'll make a flight.
What's the most likely thing to happen is you get sparks coming out of the exhaust because it's all oil soaked, so it's pretty blooming, what should we say, flammable.
After a road journey of 2,000 miles, the engine bursts flawlessly into life, relieving David and Theo's anxiety that the journey may have damaged the engine of 1264. They now confront another of their fears: high temperature together with high winds, which are not decreasing as they had hoped. They seek local opinion.
The feeling is the wind is stable, but it's not stable. Around us we have the sea. The cold air from the sea comes. We have
turbulence.
Yes.
It's been a really frustrating day today. We had hoped perhaps to fly now at 7 o'clock at night, but the temperature's still well up in the high 30s, and so it'd be far too dangerous to fly, even if the wind were correct, which it isn't really.
Bunny Bremner and his fellow pilots have no such choice. It is wartime, and they have to carry out their duties despite the weather conditions. Many pilots and their aircraft became casualties as a direct result of these winds. But 100 years ago, the airmen had no choice. They had to carry out their missions no matter what. A regular mission was bombing the crops in the fertile region on the mainland, depriving the Bulgarian army of supplies. Crops are still grown here today.
This whole area was being bombed by the airmen from Thassos. They were dropping their petrol bombs, and if it was windy and the heat was up, then they were successful. They had huge fires on the crops. This way, the Bulgarians couldn't have the provisions to support their army. Many times they saw Bulgarian units doing the harvest instead of farmers because they wanted to save as much as they could.
We made on the island, we made petrol bombs, and then we armed them with an inertia plunger and a Veris cartridge. And then we dropped it, the tin burst and the petrol was sowed over the crops, and the Veris cartridge set a light to it. We went quite frequently out and bombed as many of their fields as we could.
They hit their objectives, but the civilians were suffering, and there was famine all over the place.
The weather gods weren't particularly kind to us, and so we decided to get up at 5:30, get the aircraft out, and try and catch the early morning calm.
The Bristol Scout is a very light aircraft and is in danger of tipping or being dragged in strong winds, especially when landing.
We did an inspection this morning, and the condition of the new runway is still quite rough, so we're trying to minimize use of that.
The big worry, to be honest, is the roughness of the ground.
Absolutely.
Which is why we're going to use this runway. Is now, unfortunately, he's going to have the sun in his eyes as well.
He is, yeah.
Contact!
Contact! We spent years working towards this moment, and it was the first moment that I realized we'd actually achieved this quite impossible dream.
I only had a single engine machine. And when I was over these mountains, if the engine failed, I hadn't the slightest chance that I could see of making a safe landing. And the question was whether I just put my nose down and got it over quickly, or whether I came down as slowly as I could and prolonged the last 5 minutes of my life.
I had a little time to think about my granddad, but mostly, obviously, we're concentrating on the flying. It was very, very bumpy in the air, and the really critical part, of course, is the landing, and the landing went absolutely fine. So I'm absolutely delighted with that. Really, really delighted. And I just think, what a wonderful, wonderful aeroplane.
It was the joy for David to fly it, and that was why we came here. But the thought he might not come back down again because it's just never been done in 100 years.
Thank you, Pascal.
Lots of people come around and look at it, and the number of people who have obviously been, I think in many cases, very moved by the fact that we built this. We've created a unique aircraft, and they've then had the chance to see this aircraft and to see it flying has meant an awful lot.
All you can do is feel huge pride to have flown in your grandfather's flight path. It's given me a much greater respect for the things that he achieved out here. Here was a young man, only 23. He had less than 100 hours total flying time. I have 1,000 hours flying in my logbook, and here he was achieving all of those things that I really, really couldn't do, even with all of my experience and all the 100 years of of knowledge that we've acquired since then. It's an astonishing, amazing achievement.
Having flown in honour of David's grandfather, and with the winds now lashing, Scout 1264 is sheltered in its hangar, ready for tomorrow's commemoration flight. But is the weather about to finally ruin all of their plans?
Theo and I came down at about 5 o'clock. We'd been lazing by the pool and watching the increasing wind. And so we came down just to put the front on the tent, and when we got here, we found that the whole back tent, the rear tent, had blown about 20 yards away. Our hearts were absolutely in our mouths, and when we drove up, we found that miraculously, and I still don't understand how it happened, it was intact.
Over a decade of painstaking effort is almost wiped out. The team decide it's time to pack up 1264 to protect her from the increasingly volatile winds.
It's a huge, huge shame. It's a great disappointment. Poor old 1264 is absolutely covered in dust, and I hope we'll have time when we get to France to be able to give her a bit of a wipe down, poor old thing, before she has to go on public display in front of the television cameras for the Somme celebration.
Although weather conditions improve for the ceremony, winds are still high, 40-mile-an-hour gusts. But the crowds are not deterred and gather enthusiastically to join the celebrations. Despite David's disappointment of not being able to fly, Thassos and the town of Kavala pays a fitting tribute to the airmen of the Great War. A ceremony is held in honour of the Bristol Scout, where David receives, on behalf of his grandfather, the Hellenic Commendation Medal Star of Merit and Honour.
Originally, we just wanted to build the aircraft and fly it for ourselves. But David took it further, that he wanted to recreate history. And that's what he achieved when he took it to Greece, was he did recreate history. It meant an enormous amount to the people out there, and it has meant that in telling the story to so many other people that they have thought, what a wonderful achievement. It's sort of holding on to the past in a way by recreating it.
Although Scout 1264 won't fly again over Thassos, the team leave the island having achieved their ambitions of flying in memory of David's grandfather. The poppy has become the symbol of remembrance for the casualties of the First World War. The vivid red flower representing the terrible loss of life. At 7:20 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, a British mine is detonated on the Hawthorne Ridge, heralding the start of the Battle of the Somme campaign. That first day is the worst day in the history of the British Army. It suffers almost 60,000 casualties during the first 24 hours. One of those was 2nd Lieutenant David Bremner of the Border Regiment, Bunny Bremner's first cousin.
This is a really fitting end to the personal journey. We've spent many years looking at my granddad's war, which was in many ways very glamorous. But I knew much less, I knew virtually nothing about my namesake, David Bremner, and to have found out today about the personal sacrifice that he made in a dirty, gritty, personal kind of a combat. When they were ordered over the top, They had to collect together to pass over bridges over the front trench. Having done that, they then had to file slowly through the gaps in the barbed wire.
As soon as the British barrage stopped and the mine blew, the Germans obviously knew something was going to happen. They could come out of their deep dugout and realign all their machine guns, and basically the British didn't stand a chance, and they were just massacred.
And you can still feel the tension and the awful sense of foreboding they must have felt just as they went over the top. Oh, there he is.
Yeah, here we are.
Grave reference. It's always a slightly spooky feeling to see your own name on a gravestone. But having seen, what he had to do on that awful morning, you have to have huge respect for him.
This is the final resting place for thousands of brave men. But tragically, many of the dead would never be recovered. Their remains still lie hidden beneath no man's land. The salute to the men who died is thwarted again by the weather. This time it's not only wind, but also rain. The Scout and the other World War I aircraft intending to take part in the official centenary commemorations are unable to fly. After waiting most of the day, there is a sudden, unanticipated change in the weather. This is David and Theo's chance.
Contact. One of the things that we particularly wanted to do with the Bristol Scout project was to be able to commemorate the centenary of all the various events that happened in that critical year of the war. It's just to be able to fly over the spot, to be able to come here exactly 100 years after he was fatally injured has, I've found, been very, very moving indeed. And I saw the spot and all the trenches there where David was injured. And I thought of him. I'm so glad we've been able to pay tribute to his largely unremarked heroism here. It was fantastic. It was fantastic. Incredible. That is absolutely incredible. The flight was probably better than I'd expected. We've had quite a lot of turbulence all day. There have been a lot of thermals around, and you'd still expect one or two today. There were little bits of turbulence, but long patches of nice, calm stuff in between, and you could just get the controls nicely settled, and there's not a lot of force on it, and just enjoy the view. It was great. So enjoyed myself messing about up there. Yeah. It was great fun. So no, it's one of my really, really, really very special flights.
Excellent.
That was absolutely fantastic.
Good.
And worth all the waiting.
Starting with just 3 small parts, 1264 is now the only operational Bristol Scout in the world. And Bunny Bremner would have been proud to fly her.
Oh, it was a wonderful machine. You could do anything in it. And it was the best machine I ever flew. I enjoyed it thoroughly.